Welcome to Cinema 4D Basecamp, and welcome to Orientation Week. Now, this is a chunky boy of a lesson. I know you probably have noticed that, but it's going to be a very important introduction to the world, the magical world of 3D, specifically Cinema 4D. Now, you have all week to get through this lesson, and it's going to set you up for a lot of success as this course starts ramping up. And of course, these School of Motion courses, they're not that easy, okay? They're made to push you, to challenge you, so you have a lot of growth by the end of it. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this very first week. And we're going to be getting you really nice and comfortable in Cinema 4D, learning the UI, learning some important shortcut keys, and we're going to commit a lot of stuff to muscle memory. So again, once we move on from this orientation week and things really start to get serious, you're going to be feeling really good and comfortable and prepared for when the challenges start coming, and you're going to jump over those hurdles like an amazing Olympic athlete. So with that being said, let's go ahead, let's dive into Cinema 4D, and how about we get this party started? All right, here we are. Welcome to the Cinema 4D interface. A lot of buttons. I'm sure that's what you're thinking, but don't worry, I'm going to be walking you through this. We're going to get really, really comfortable in this app. You're going to know what a lot of these buttons are. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, just remember that you probably felt the same way when you learned other software, and look at where you are now. You definitely rocked all these other softwares. You're feeling comfortable in them, and you're going to feel the same way by the end of this course in Cinema 4D. So it's totally fine to feel a little overwhelmed, but don't worry. I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to hold your hand through the world of 3D. And we're going to make some cool stuff. So what are we going to be doing today? Well, we're going to be making our first 3D project. And for us, it's going to be making a little ramen restaurant made entirely of primitive objects. You might be wondering, what are primitive objects? Are they something the cave people use? No. Primitive shapes are, if you look at this little icon menu over here, this strip of icons, these are all the different types of objects you can add to your scene. So you can see you can add lights, cameras, all these other little bendy thing, what the tracker dot, I don't know what that is. We'll figure out what those are later on. But the most important button we're going to be worried about today is this little cube right here. So if I click and hold, you'll see that these are our primitive objects. So primitive objects are all your basic fundamental 3D shapes that you can use as like building blocks or Legos to create more complex objects. So you can see we got a cube, we got a sphere, pyramid. So these are basically like your basic 2D shapes in any 2D app. So Illustrator, After Effects, instead of a rectangle, you got a cube. Instead of a circle, you got a sphere. So just like you use those basic 2D shapes to build up designs, we can use these basic 3D shapes to build up 3D designs, okay? So let's grab a cylinder. So I'm just gonna hover over a cylinder and release my mouse, and you can see three things happened. Number one, you can see in our viewport, this is what this is called, we summoned a cylinder, and it appeared, voila. You can also see that right here is our objects tab or objects manager. And it's basically like your comp window where you have all your layers populated in it. And this is where all your objects live in your object manager. It's very aptly named. So it manages all of your objects. And then down here is the attributes manager, kind of like your properties panel. So when you select an object, the attributes of that object are going to pop up here. And by default, we're going to be in the object tab. You can see that's highlighted. You can tab over to all these different items here, but in the object tab is the most important object property. So you can see we got the radius, and if we want to adjust it, we can adjust this slider here, or we can hover over the number and adjust things there. So you can adjust the height, segments, we'll get into a little bit later, basically how many subdivisions. You can see this a little chunky, so you can adjust the segments to add more definition there to round things out. But again, we'll cover that a little bit later. And then you also have the coordinates tab, which is also very important. It's basically your position, your rotation, and your scale. So just like any layer in After Effects, you have your position, rotation, scale. Here, we just have it in 3 dimensions. Again, just like we clicked and dragged on these numbers, you can also click and drag on the Y, X, Y, Z here to move that in your viewport. So you can also move things around by just hovering over any of these 3D axes. And if you're not familiar with 3D axes, like that's basically the same 3D axis that you have in After Effects. If you're working with 3D layers, you have your Y, which goes up and down. You have your Z, which goes forward and back, and your X, which goes horizontally. And if you ever forget what is what, X, Y, and Z, there's this little gizmo up here that says, Y is always green, Z is always blue, and X is always red. So it's color coded. So really good if you're new to 3D to recognize what is X, what is Y, and what is Z. And you can see as I'm moving this around the viewport, it's updating those transforms there as well. So you'll also notice that in addition to these axes arrows, we have these little corners. And what these corners do is allow you to constrain the movement of an object to a 2D plane. So if I hover over this green corner and click and drag, you can see, look in that coordinate manager over here, you can see that I'm moving this around and the Y is stationary. So I'm constraining this to only move in the X and Z dimensions, okay? You can see that those axes are highlighted. And then I can hover over right here and you can see that highlights the Y and X. So if I hover over here, you can see that I'm not moving the Z. You can see over here, not moving in the Z axis. And here, same thing, we're gonna actually move in the 2D plane of Y and Z. So we won't be able to move this along the X. So I highly recommend if you're gonna move any objects and you're seeing to get used to moving things precisely using these axes arrows. The one thing you don't want to do is move this just all willy-nilly like, because say you wanted to move this over in the X. So you would think, okay, I'm going to move this from left to right and it's only going to change the X coordinate, but watch over here as I move this all willy-nilly like. It's actually moving this back in Z space. It's moving it in the Y. So it's not very precise to move things, again, all willy-nilly. I always like to move these in constrained motions there. And if you want to reset anything back to its original position, so right back dead center in what is 0, 0, 0 and X, Y, and Z, I can just hover over this arrow over here or this arrow over here and just right click on that arrow and that will zero everything out, reset that value back to its default position. So another thing you can do, instead of just, willy-nilly bringing things up and down, you can just enter in values by clicking on that number and it'll highlight it and I can just enter 50. I could also use this as a calculator and I can say plus 50 equals 100. I knew that and I'm terrible at math, but if I did say like 2 times 18, you might have to think a little harder, use your multiplication tables. And, this also works with multiplication. You can do minus, so 35 minus 5. And hit enter. And so these are like little calculators for you. So if you need to get really precise values, you can do that using the maths. So let me just reset that back to default. And you know what? We are messing with a cylinder. Let's go and let's talk about cube. So I'm going to delete this cylinder. So I'm just going to select it. See if I click off of that, we're not going to have the axes visible, but the moment I select it, it's going to highlight yellow. You can also see there's this little orange outline too, and the axis, of course, appears in these little dots, which if we go to the object tab here, these dots actually control the radius and the height. So these dots are very useful. So you don't have to, adjust them here. You can also just adjust everything in the viewport. So we kind of looked at the cylinder. Let's see what another primitive shape has as far as object properties and all that good stuff. So I'm going to select the cylinder. I'm going to delete it and let's go and let's click and hold and let's add a cube to our scene. Okay. And so there's our cube. You can see the object tab is automatically selected. And we have all these different object properties that are different from the cylinder. Of course, we don't have a radius for a cube. We do have a fillet radius, which again is fancy word for rounding. So if I click that on, you can see it rounds the edges, which makes this look a lot nicer. But you can see how we have these little dots here as well. And if I click and drag on those dots, it's adjusting the size in the X, Y, and Z. You can see in the coordinates tab, same coordinates as the other object there. And you can also go and put in precise values here as well. So 200 by 200. And if I select a value here and I want to go to the next one, I can just hit tab and that will tab downwards to the next value and I can enter in a value. Okay. And so we have segments X, Y, and Z. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but let's go ahead and let's use a cube to create the floor of our ramen restaurant. So let's go ahead and let's just adjust this right here. And one thing that's kind of annoying is you don't get precise values. You get all of these decimals. If there's one thing that drives me absolutely crazy, it's all of these decimals. I like nice round numbers, and I actually recommend that you do the same thing so you can have precise values versus like all willy-nilly decimal places up to 4 places of decimals. So let's go ahead And for the size, let's actually go with 200. So I'll enter in 200. That's a nice round number. And then for the size in the Y, let's make this just an even 10. Okay. And then for the size Z, let's put in 200. Okay. Now, if you click and drag here, you'll be able to move this in values of 1 centimeter and increments of 1 centimeters. If you want to actually get to a more fine-tuned type of control, you can hold down the Alt or Option key and click and drag, and this will actually go into the tenths, so you can get much more precise there. I'm just going to go and just click on that and just enter in 200 again. There's also another way you can constrain things, moving things up and down, or in whatever direction you want to go. And that's holding the Shift key down. So if I click and hold on one of the axes and then hold the Shift key down, you can see I'm moving this in increments of 5 centimeters, which is very handy. But again, I'll just move this back to, I'll just zero that out, enter 0, and then hit enter. And if you ever need to undo, it's just Control or Command Z. Okay, so I can undo all that. I can redo by hitting Control Y, and that'll redo. And there's also these back and forward buttons, kind of like a browser window that is also undo or redo, okay? And you can also see, if I hover over here, keep an eye for right down here, because there's little helpers that pop up when you hover over anything that shows you what things do. So full undo, full redo. You can go over here and you can see, okay, add rectangle object, add cube object. I can hover over here and like, what is this? Okay, use model mode. That's point edge. Okay, so you can get an idea of what all of these buttons are by just holding it and looking right here. Or if you hover long enough over an object, it'll pop up right next to that object. So Cinema 4D is very helpful in that regard, where there's a lot of helpful hints all over the interface. So let's go to the object tab here. We got our floor. That's looking really good. Nice round numbers, no decimals. And we got this fillet radius. And for the fillet, let's actually just enter in manually 2.5. Kind of like that a little bit better. And let's rename this so we don't have cube 1, cube 2, cube 3, because ultimately what we want to do is duplicate this floor to create the roof. So let's go ahead and I'm going to double click on the cube text, and that will highlight it. And that's when I can just enter in whatever I want. So let me rename this floor. And now what we can do is go ahead and duplicate this, and we can duplicate multiple ways. So one is by just clicking on the object, highlighting it, and doing Command or Control C and Command or Control V. And that will copy and paste that object. So you move this up and you can see, okay, we got 2 cubes there. Now I'm going to delete that by just hitting delete. And let's do this another way. So you can also duplicate an object in the object manager by selecting an object, holding down the Command or Control key down and clicking, and you'll see there's that arrow and a plus sign. And if I just release my mouse and control, you'll see that we just duplicated that object there. Okay, so that's another way. I'll delete that. And then the last way, and the way I like to do duplication a lot, so that I don't have to go into Object Manager or anything like that, is you can duplicate directly in the viewport. And how you can do this is, if I'm going to duplicate this, I'll hold the Command or Control key down, and you'll see that our cursor has 2 little boxes. And if I hover over the Y-axis, because I want to constrain this along the Y-axis, and click and drag, you'll see that, voila, I'm like Houdini of cubes. I just made a cube appear from another cube, and you can see I can move this up. Now, with the Command or Control key held down and holding the Shift key, I can constrain that movement along the Y-axis in increments of 5 degrees. So if I want to move this precisely up 170 centimeters, I can do that. And I'm just going to release my mouse and my shortcut keys there. And there's my roof. And I'll just rename this to roof.base. So this will be the base of the roof. We'll add like overhangs and all that kind of stuff to this a little bit later. So, but there is the roof base. And you can see that, our objects aren't very centered here. So I'm going to show you how we can go and navigate around our viewport. And these are very important shortcut keys. You should definitely commit them to memory, but they're very easy to remember. So that's nice. And the shortcut keys are 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So if my cursor's hovering in the viewport, I can hold down the 1 key and click and drag, and this is my pan. Okay. If I hold down the 2 key and click and drag, that's my zoom. And if I hold down my 3 key and click and drag, that's my orbit. Okay, so 1, pan, 2, zoom, 3, orbit. Now you can see that cursor kind of showed up. And what's pretty cool is you can contextually orbit around your cursor. Okay. So if I want to orbit around this corner of this cube, I can hold the 3 key down and click and drag on this corner. And you can see I'm orbiting around that corner. If I want to zoom into that corner, I can hover over that corner with my cursor and hold the 2 key down, click and drag, extreme close up to that corner of the cube there. Okay, so this is very nice to like zoom in and get details and pan and zoom out. And so you want to get to the point where you're using the 1, 2, and 3 keys without even thinking about it. It's just kind of second nature. Your brain is just automatically controlling your left hand, or if you're left-handed, your right hand on your keyboard, and you're just not even thinking about it. And you're just moving and grooving around in 3D space and rocking and rolling. So 1, 2, 3, very helpful. You can also pan, zoom, and orbit using these little icons up here, but these are just really laborious. There's no real reason to use them. I highly recommend you just get used to 1, 2, and 3 and getting your feet wet that way. If you ever zoom way out and you're like, what happened? My objects just went off screen. You can see that this will give you a little hint. If you click on that arrow, it'll recenter your selected object to your view. And if you ever want to get back to the default view that when you open a new project in Cinema 4D, it's that view, you just go up to View and then Frame Default. So if you ever go way crazy and you don't know where things are, just go View, Frame Default, and that'll get you back to your default position of your viewport view. And you can not be afraid of losing your objects way off in 3D land somewhere in your viewport. All right, so let's continue building out our nice little ramen restaurant here. And what I want to do, let me just get this doodle tool so I can paint here. I'm going to build some supports so our roof isn't just kind of floating around here. And I cannot draw a line to save my life, apparently, but hopefully you get the idea. We're going to make some little supports, and I'm just going to go back to my move tool so I can move things around. Okay. And let's go ahead and let's create another cube. This is going to be a pretty skinny little structure. So let's just go and let's make this pretty skinny. And let's actually just make this, again, I like round numbers, so let's do 10. I'm going to tab down twice and do 10. So we got 10 by 10 by 200. And remember, we have this at coordinate 0 in Y, and this is 170 centimeters tall. So let's actually make it so this object is halfway in between. So what that means is we're going to have 170 divided by 2, which is 85. And that should give us right smack in the center there. So all we need to do is just make this a little shorter there, go back in the object tab, and let's see, let's make this about 160. Should be pretty good. And let's just add some fillet, some fancy rounding there. And I'm just going to give this a fillet radius of 2.5. And let's actually move this up a little bit because that rounding kind of leaves a little bit of gap. So we'll just make this, let's just say 161. I hate that it's not a round number, but hey, okay. So let's go ahead and let's move this into the corner. And this is where it's helpful to bring up our 4-up 3D view to make sure everything is kind of aligned to the corner there. And to do that, we're going to go to this upper right corner here, this little box within the box. That's going to toggle our active view. And if I click that, you can see our 4-up view. So if you're used to, say, After Effects, if you work in 3D there's the same 4-up view. We have our right, top, and our front. So we can go to our top here, and we can just make sure this support is like flush to the corner here. So again, when you move things around, make sure you're doing them constrained to different axes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover over the x-axis, click and drag, hold the shift key down to constrain to increments of 5 centimeters. And you can see if I go 95 centimeters, this is pretty flush. So I can use my zoom, pan, and all those other tools in all these other views too. So 1, 2, and 3 doesn't work as you would expect, but it just kind of rotates around. And if you ever want to undo a move like this, hit Command or Control, Shift, and Z, and that will undo your viewport moves, okay? So Command or Control, Shift, and Z. You can also go to View and do Undo View, and it will show you the shortcut key there as well. Cool. So now all we have to do is just move this to the upper area here. So I'm just going to move this along the Z. So I'm going to highlight the Z axis, click and drag, and then hold the shift key down to constrain and go 95 centimeters that way. And if I zoom in here, you can see that's nice and flush to that back corner there. Cool. So now what we can do is we can still utilize our top view and highlight the X-axis, and we're going to duplicate this. So remember, to duplicate, we're going to hold the Command or Control key down. You'll see the cursor has those two boxes. I'm going to click and drag, highlighting the X-axis, and then while still holding the Command or Control key down, I'm going to hold the Shift key down. I'm sorry if your hand's cramping right now, but I'm going to hold the Shift key down to constrain increments of 5 centimeters and release my mouse. And you'll see, okay, I just duplicated those two objects, and I actually forgot to rename these. So now we got cube 1, cube 2, and it's like, well, what are those cubes? Let's rename those to support, and we'll rename this support.1. And then we'll just, instead of duplicating this 2 more times, we can just select both of these supports by adding to our selection by holding the Command or Control key down and clicking. So we have both these objects selected. And then again, I'll hold the Control key down, hover over the Z axis, click and drag, hold the Shift key down again. It's like a Vulcan neck pinch kind of thing with your hand, and go 190 centimeters. And that's looking like that's pretty flush. Yep. And so now we got our 4 supports. So now we can kind of maximize this perspective view. We can maximize any view by clicking on the corner icon in any of these views. So I can maximize the top view. I can go back to my 4-up view by clicking that again, or I can just maximize the perspective view. There's also some very useful shortcut keys. So F1 goes to perspective, F2 is top, F3 right, F4 front, and F5 brings up your 4-up view. So typically I'll go between my F1 and F5 to go from perspective to my 4-up. So another set of handy, useful shortcut keys there for you. And so if I have a bunch of objects that are all kind of the same thing, I like to group them together, okay? So for all these support objects, I'm just gonna, again, hold the Control or Command key down, and I can click and add to my selection, or I can select the one object, hold the Shift key down, and select the topmost object, and it'll select all those objects in between. And I can group these together underneath a null. So if you're used to After Effects, you know that there's different nulls in After Effects as well. And there's also group folders inside of, say, Photoshop, where you can group different layers together. And if you select that group folder, you can move everything around. So we're going to do the exact same thing here. And to group objects together underneath a null, we're going to right click and go to Group Objects. Now, it's very helpful in Cinema 4D. You also have the shortcut keys listed right next to that command. So Alt-G for the PC is going to be my shortcut key. It'll be Option-G if you're on a Mac. So what I like to do is to learn everything and learn and commit all of these shortcut keys to memory. I like to see what the shortcut key is. And instead of just using that option, I'm just going to get out of that and say, okay, it's Alt-G. I'm going to hit Alt, or again, Option-G on Mac, and Alt-G, there is all of my objects, and now they turned into a null. You might be like, well, where are all my cubes? You'll see there's this little plus sign here. And if I click the plus sign, you'll see, okay, we just unfolded that null, and there's all of our objects underneath it, okay? So let's actually double click and rename this to support.group. That's funny. And you'll see that we can twirl this up and down, just like you can twirl up and down different collapse and uncollapse effects and shape layer options and all that kind of stuff. Or even, again, when I was talking about Photoshop group layers, you can, or effects, you can fold and unfold to show them or hide them and collapse them. So with that null selected, you can see that I actually have an axis center of that null, kind of averages out all the positions of all these individual axes. So if I select all these different axes, let's actually go to our 4-up view. You can see that you have all these individual axes of our individual objects. And if I select all of them, it's going to average out and create an axis center right in the middle that averages out all those positions. And that's where it created that null. Okay. So just like in any other application, you can also adjust just the axis center of an object. So for this null, say I wanted to move this axis, say up or down, I can go to this enable axis modification option here. And the shortcut key for that is L. And it's very easy to accidentally hit L, and you'll activate that and you'll try to move something. You're like, why did that just move the axis and not the object? That's why you were accidentally in this mode. So I'm going to Command or Control Z to undo that. But just so you know, that's how you can adjust the axis center. Hold the Shift key down to constrain as normal. And if I now say want to rotate by hitting the R key or going to the rotate over here, you can see that's where I'm going to rotate around. Again, I'm still in the axis modification. If I want to actually rotate these objects, I need to get out of that. And now if I rotate, you can see I'm rotating around that axis center. So Command and Control Z to undo all those moves. And then to get back to my move tool, I'll just click right here. Cool. And that's basically it. So you can move everything around. It's all grouped together. If I wanted to remove one of these objects out from underneath this null, we can do this by just clicking on an object, dragging that out from underneath that null, and just placing that down there. And so now if I move this around, you'll see that this parent null is only controlling the objects underneath it. So you can almost think of this as like a pick whip, where you're pick whipping the layers to a single null in After Effects, and you have that one null controlling all these objects. But this is like that much asked for layer groups that everyone's asking for After Effects. This is basically that inside of Cinema 4D. So if I want to move this support cube back underneath that group, I just need to go up, and you'll see a highlight that null, and it'll have an arrow pointing downward saying, okay, you want to add this object to that group. Yep. And I accidentally missed, so I'll go back again, and there we go. We have that object as a child of this main parent null, and that's back and gonna move wherever I move that parent null, okay? So hierarchies are very important. The parent-child relationships are very, very important in Cinema 4D, and we'll cover a lot more of that throughout this course, but that's kind of the basics of it. So what we can do is we can twirl that back up because we really don't need to see all those other objects kind of cluttering up our object manager here. And now what we can do is let's create these little sidewalls here. So let's get our doodle tool back. And we'll create like these little sidewalls, and then we'll build a little bar on top, little bar thingy there. And again, I apologize that I say I'm an artist, and that's how I draw. That's how I draw people. So let's create those sidewalls first. Let's go and bring up the cube menu. And we actually don't even need to bring up the cube menu, because if you just click on this cube, it'll default to just creating a cube object. So you don't need to, do all the other stuff and open this up and select cube. You can just hit cube, make a cube automatically. And what we can do now is create those sidewalls. So if you're ever lost as far as like, what is the front of my object? The front of your object is here. So Y is up and X is to the right. Okay. So if you're like this, you're like, okay, well, this, I'm actually looking at the back, because now the X arrow is pointing left and I'm all switched around. And if X is pointing towards me, then I'm looking at the side. So if you ever get lost, again, go to View, Frame Default, and this will show you your default view. And okay, this is the front. All right. So let's move this wall forward. So I'll hold the Shift key down. I'm going to hover over and highlight the Z axis, because I'm going to constrain to the Z axis and just move this forward. And let's actually shrink this down. And let's make this a thickness of about 10 centimeters in the Z. So again, nice round numbers. And let's move this forward again. And it looks like that makes it flush. So if that coordinates negative 95 centimeters in the Z. So that's looking good. Let's bring this down in the Y, and let's go to like about that tall. So let's just call that 55, and I'll move this up again, holding the Shift key down, move that up to 30 centimeters, and that's looking pretty good. And then I'll just bring this in like so, and let's call that 180. Okay. And so now let's turn on the fillet and just put in 2.5 for that nice bevel. And actually you can see that actually these objects are kind of intersecting there. So let's just maybe bring this down. Again, going to the side view here will be helpful to see, okay, are we intersecting there? Let's actually say that's 50, okay? And that should be nice and flush, okay? So definitely helpful to use nice round numbers. Let's rename this from cube to wall, And what I'm going to do is we're at the front. Let's just duplicate this and move it to the back. So again, hold the control key down, get the cursor with the two boxes, hover over the Z axis, click drag, hold the shift key down, and we'll move that back. And it looks like 190 centimeters. We'll place that flush on the back there. That's looking good. And now what we can do is we've got these two walls. We can just select these two walls. So I'll just add to my selection by holding the control key down, clicking on that other wall. And let's do Command and Control C, Command and Control V, and that will duplicate those objects, create two new objects. And now I'm going to rotate these objects together by hitting the R key, or again, hitting this button here for the rotate tool. So I'll hit R. And when you bring up the rotation tool, you'll get all the different color-coded, instead of arrows, you'll get rotational bands. So just like I like to constrain things in different axes, I also want to constrain rotation to different axes as well. So I want to rotate these around this way. So that means I want to constrain to the Y-axis rotation, okay? So if I hover over this green axis rotation and click and drag, you'll see I'm actually constraining the rotation to rotating around the Y-axis. And just like you can constrain in centimeters by holding the shift key, you can hold the shift key down and constrain to degrees. So I can constrain to 90 degrees, and voila, I got all my four walls. So if I want to get back to my move tool to move anything around, I can either go over here and click on the move tool, or I can look and see what that shortcut key is, which is E. So another helpful shortcut key group to memorize is E for move, R for rotate, and T for scale. Okay. And that'll bring up these other types of, instead of arrows, they're blocks. You can click and drag and scale everything up and down. I'm just going to Command or Control Z to undo that. But E, R, T, R is the only thing that makes sense because it's rotation. E, move, E is a way to remember it, I guess. R, rotation. And then T for scale. To scale? I don't know, to scale. But those are your main movement tools there. So I'll just hit E for move, and there we go. So let me show you one other way to duplicate all these walls. So let's just say I have one wall here, and let's actually just move this back to 0. So I'm just gonna right click on the Y and Z and just bring this back to coordinates XYZ 0, 0, 0, okay? And we can duplicate these with one fell swoop. So I got the wall selected. I'm going to go up to tools, and under tools, there's all these really helpful commands. So you can see there's where our move, rotate, and scale tools are. But down here, we can actually do something that will duplicate an object automatically without us having to duplicate things 4 times or anything like that. So if I choose duplicate, and you'll see there's this like X'd out arrow, I can't like select anything here, and nothing is actually duplicated here either. But one thing we have to do is actually fill out all these options here first. So I want to duplicate this one object 3 times to create a total of 4 objects. So I'll bring down the copies to 3. And then for the mode, you can either duplicate this linearly along a straight line or duplicate this around a circle. Okay. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I'll choose circle, and you'll still see nothing's happening. But what I'm going to do is hit apply. And when you hit apply, and if I just zoom out here, you'll see that this created 4, or actually 3 copies. So the original one's still there, and it created 3 more, and it's orientating them around this circle. So if I bring this radius down, you can see I can bring these in, and it looks like a radius of 95 is working pretty good. Yeah, it looks good. And that's basically it. So with one button click or a couple button clicks, we just duplicated all those objects around a circle. And you can see here's our wall copies here. So 1, 2, 3. And we can just place this wall as a child of this wall copies null. And if I want to bring back up my move tool, again, the shortcut key for that is E, where you click this button, but just remember that's E. Commit it to memory. And then we can just move this up. Let's hold the shift key down and move that up 30 centimeters. And that is looking nice and flush. And we'll just rename this wall group. Cool. So let's quickly create that little like ledge there where we can have the ramen bowls sitting there like so. Again, delete that real quick. Bad drawings. So let's go ahead. And what we can do is we can do the same technique, and we can just command click and drag to duplicate this one wall object rename this bar. And we'll twirl up that wall group. We don't need to deal with that anymore. And you would think, okay, if we want a flat bar, we would just like rotate this, okay, and constrain the rotation. But you'll see that when we rotate an object, Z is down and X is actually still consistent. So at any time you can keep the axes consistent with the world axes. So Y is up, Z is back, X is horizontal. So I'll undo that. So instead of rotating, I'll just adjust these values here to make this a flatter object. So if I go to the bar, go to the object tab here, I'll just say that's a thickness of 10. And then for Z, let's round this out and just say that's like 55. So there we go. So now the only thing I'm going to do is the Y transform is okay, but the Z position, let's actually zero that out. So it's actually aligned to the center and it's just moved up. Okay, because that's important because we'll actually duplicate from the center outwards when we do the duplicate command again. So I got that bar selected. We'll go to tools again, duplicate, and you'll see that I'll actually store the copies and the circle option we had before. The only thing we need to do is again, hit apply. And voila, it created the 3 extra copies and we can adjust the radius here. And if we go to our top view, we can see, all right, what makes this flush? And it looks like, what is that? 118, even though I hate that actually 117 looks pretty good. And so that's looking good. We'll maximize the perspective view. We'll hit E for the move tool. And then all we got to do is just adjust this all on the Y. And actually with this copies, let's just actually make this bar a child of that main bar copies group. So we can select this null and move everything together. And again, I'll hold the shift key down. It looks like we're going to have to go decimal points here. Actually, let's just round that out and go 60. That actually works really well. Cool, 60. And I'll just rename this bar dot group. And what we can do now is like adjust things. So I can select this cube here and just move this back maybe like 10 centimeters or even more. Let's go another 5. So this is like the main bar. And then for these sides, I can actually select by holding the shift key down and selecting this other object. And maybe I want to make these bars a little bit more narrow. So I can, with those 2 objects, with those 2 cubes selected, I can go to the object tab of those cubes and I can adjust the Z size for both of these at the same time. So let's round these out to say 40. And so now I can move this in 5 centimeters, holding the shift key down, I can move this in 5 centimeters on the Z. And hopefully at this point, you know, all of these shortcut keys are becoming kind of second nature to you. And for this back bar, maybe we don't even need a bar in the back because that's where the cooking is going to happen. We'll have like some little ramen cookers back here. So we'll just delete that last bar table in the back there. And voila, we got the start of a little ramen restaurant here. Now, we did a lot of work. We should have been saving a lot this whole entire time. So let's do that for the first time. So I'm going to go to File, Save Project, or just Save As. You can name the name. And I'm just going to write over this ramen restaurant file here, hit Save, and yes. And there's actually autosave in Cinema 4D. It's not turned on by default. So word of advice, if you want to turn on the autosave, go to Edit, Preferences, go to Files, and here's autosave. So you can turn that on. You can choose how many, like after how many minutes do you want it to autosave, then how many backup copies do you want. So right now, by default, if you save 10 copies, it's going to constantly write over the older of the 10 with the newer of the 10. For my instance of recording this course, I'm going to keep it off, but do as I say, not as I do. Turn that on because it'll save you. Trust me. There are so many times people discovered autosave that they're just like shocked it's not on by default, but there you go. All right, I'm sure we're all pretty sick of cubes right now, so let's learn how to use some other objects. So let's build those little ramen cookers that I was mentioning, and we'll place them right back here. So let's go to our primitives menu. Let's grab a cylinder. And again, we're going to move this back, constraining it on the ZX plane. And let's just hit T for scale, and we'll just scale this down. Hit E to move, and move this up. So we're learning our shortcut keys. We'll select these little dots here to adjust the radius, and then adjust this dot for the height. So if I select the cylinder, you can see on the object tab here, we got some wacky values with all those decimals right there. And let's go to our top view so we can position this precisely. So something like that. And let's again round out these values. So let's do a radius of 30. I'll tab down to the height and let's do this about 50. And then we'll move this on up. Now you'll see that here are our subdivisions, our segments that I was mentioning before. You can control the segments and that's adding more subdivisions. And if I zoom in, hitting the 2 key and zooming in on that cylinder, you can see how chunky this is. So the more rotation segments we have, the smoother that will be. Now, the more segments you have on some of your objects, you might actually slow down the viewport because the more segments, the more subdivisions, the heavier your scene gets and the more your computer's calculating all those things. So what I like to do is think of, okay, if I'm viewing this from outside this entire time, I actually don't need that much detail. I can actually bring this down because you can't really notice that it's kind of a little janky there, but if it's really low, then yes, that's obviously looking janky. So always determine how many segments you need by how far away like your view is going to be when you actually go and render this, okay? So 24 segments or 26 looks pretty good. For the height segments, that's actually these segments here. We actually don't even need 4. We just need the 1. So you can always save on the amount of segments there too by removing the ones you don't need. And okay, so we got 1 here. Let's rename this to ramen.cooker. And let's create the lid here. But first, again, I like to add little roundness to it, little bevels. So on that ramen cooker, I'll go to the caps. So this is in a different place from the cubes here. So the fillet was right there in the object tab. On the cylinder object, the fillet is in the caps because the cap is the top and the bottom of our cylinder. So let me just maximize my perspective view. So the bottom cap there. And so when we turn on the fillet, it's in the caps tab. So if I turn that on, you can see that adds our rounding. Again, you can adjust the rounding by clicking on that dot there. And so let's give this a radius of about 2, nice round number. And then what we can do is let's create the lid. So to create the lid, I'll select the Y-axis here, hover over it, hit the Command or Control key down because we're going to duplicate this and we'll just move this up, release our mouse. Let's rename this to Ramen Cooker Top. And then we'll just bring this down in the Y scale and we'll make this a little bit thicker in the radius there. So maybe 35. And we'll move this down like so. And for the height, I'll just round that down to 6. And so there's our little lid. And then what we can do, can even maybe make that a little thinner. And so now what I want to do is I want this lid to have like a little handle top so people can grab it. And so what I'm going to do for that is create a cube, but I want the cube to appear when I create it right where this top is. Okay, I want it to be aligned to the axis center of this top. So to do that, we can go and we can grab a cube. And before I release the mouse, I'm going to hold down the Command or the Control key and release my mouse. And you'll see that that will place a cube right where our axis center of the selected object we had selected there. Okay, so now I can hit T for scale that down. I can hit E for move this up, and we'll just make this a little bit longer and a little skinnier. And that's all I'm looking for like a little handle. Okay, so for the handle, I'll rename that handle and we'll make a little bit of rounding there too. Because everything looks a lot better when it's nice and rounded. And maybe even go in here and up the rotation segments to smooth that out. And this is looking pretty good. So here's all of our ramen cooker elements. So I'm going to select them all by holding the Control key or Command key down and clicking all of them to add to the selection. And I'll group these together. And remember, that is Alt or Option G. And now I can just double click on that null. And this is Ramen Cooker Group. And now I can move all these objects all at once. I can hit R and rotate this slightly so it doesn't look so weird that it's like straight parallel to the bar. And another thing I can do is duplicate this and make another cooker right next to it. So to do that, I'll hit Command or Control and click and drag to duplicate it. And if I want to move this, you can see I can't move this precisely along the x-axis here because I rotated it, and rotating it constrained to the x-axis is actually going to move it this way. So there's one way where we can actually get back the global axis or the world axis versus the local axis that got rotated. And that is by going to this button here, and that toggles between the world and the local object coordinate system. Okay, so if I go and click this on, the world system, which is aligned to the world coordinates, will allow me to now move this along the actual world x-axis here. Okay, so the shortcut key for that is W. Again, it's another one of those keys you can accidentally hit and wonder why you can't get the local axis there. So now if I hit R to rotate this again, I'll rotate this differently. And you can see that, again, if I wanted to move this along the X, it would be off center. So again, if I wanted to move this precisely along the global X coordinates, I'll hit that. Or again, remember it, hit W, and I can move this along the actual world X. And that's the local X, okay? So local world coordinates, super important to understand there, but this is looking pretty good. So there's the Ramen Cooker Group 2. And now let's create a little lantern. So for that, let's go and create another cylinder, and let's just move this over here, hit T for scale. We'll move a little bit faster because we're learning all the shortcut keys. We'll move this here and maybe get our 4-up view just to position everything accurately here. Move this like so. And so let's go and rename this lantern. And let's adjust the radius here. Again, I like round numbers, 60. And let's make this a little more smooth, so we'll up the rotation segments there. And let's add that fillet. And I'm going to make this pretty big, like a really big fillet there. So maybe a radius of 10. So that's looking pretty good. Maybe make this a little bit taller. And you can see how chunky this edge is right there, the fillet segments. So to up that and round it out, we can just add more segments to smooth that out, add more definition. That's looking good. And what I'm going to do is duplicate this. So I'm just going to hit Command or Control C, Command or Control V, and duplicate this. And this will be like the lantern center, because this will be this part here. And we'll adjust that rounding there. So, you know, lanterns have that little center bit. Okay, looking good. And I don't need to be in my 4-up view anymore, I don't think. So that's looking pretty good. And now we just need a little pole to attach this lantern to this roof. So what we can do is just create another cylinder here off of this existing cylinder. So I'll hit Command or Control, click and drag this up to duplicate that lantern center object, rename this to pole. And I actually need this to be facing horizontally or laid horizontally here. So again, you would think, okay, I'll hit R and rotate this. But again, if you can prevent it, I wouldn't rotate any objects you don't need to. And luckily with some of these objects, if you go to the Object tab, you can actually change the orientation here without rotating it. So I can change the orientation and notice that axis stays consistent to the world axis there. So if I go to like plus Y, this is perfect. And so now I can adjust this and move this like so. And again, constraining along different axes here. Adjust the rounding, we'll move this out, and let's adjust the radius to say 3. So that's looking pretty good. And again, look from all angles, because one thing you don't want to do is like have something look good in one angle and be floating in midair in the other angle. So that's all looking good. And what I'm going to do is Command click and drag again, drag this out, and I'll just make this a little thicker, and this will just be like the little cap. So it's really easy to, once you create one object, to duplicate it and add all these nice little details. It's always helpful to have big, medium, and small details. So that's looking good. And then let me just rename this pole cap so we know what that is. And then all we need is like a little string here. So command click and drag. I'm just command click and dragging and duplicating these different ways just so you kind of get in the habit of knowing all the ways to do it. And we actually don't need a cap for, or a fillet for this because it's just a little string. That's looking good. Now we just need to create where the string wraps around the pole. So what I'm going to select this pole and we're going to create a new primitive we haven't used before, and that's the torus. So again, if I want to create this object right at the axis center of this selected pole object, I'm again going to hold the Command or Control key down, and this is really big. So let's hit T for scale. You can see how big that is. I'm going to hit T for scale, scale this down. And there's our little torus. And again, you would think you would rotate this, but this also has that orientation tab in the object tab. So if we just orientate this to +Y, this is aligned the right way. And these also have these little dots that control the ring radius and the pipe radius there. So we can adjust things like that. Again, I'm going to round this out to maybe 1.25, ring radius of like 3. And so I can move this like so. T for scale, scale this up a little bit, and then Command or Control click and drag and highlight the X axis and just move this down. And I can hold the Shift key down to select this other object and just make sure that's all nice and aligned. And now we got our little string wrapped around that pole. So for the torus, these two torus objects here, I can rename both of these at the same time by going to the Basic tab. And this is where like visibility options, which I'll get into a little bit later, but you can actually rename things at the same time. You'll see this is mixed, meaning they both have different names. But if I select the name, it'll actually rename both of these objects to whatever I name it here. So I'll name this string, or actually let's do rope, and hit enter. And you'll see I just renamed both those objects at the same time. And if I go to this object here, I can double click and rename this to string and hit enter, and you'll see that'll update in that Basic tab there too. So I'll go back to the object tab, and there's all these options here. 1.25, keep that consistent with those other objects, and that's looking pretty good. So we have all of these objects here. I'll hold the Shift key down and select the bottom object, and these are all the objects that make up our lantern. So I'll group these together as well. So Alt or Option G, rename this, double click, lantern.group. So now there's one thing we could do, and that is to move the axis center to maybe right there. So to do that, we'll go into the Enable Axis Modification mode. The shortcut key for that is L, and we can move this up, hold the Shift key down, and move that in increments of 5, and move this along the Z. And so now if we wanted to, remember to get out of that Axis Modification mode once you're done. So remember that's deactivated. And if I rotate this, we can rotate along that axis if we wanted to, say, bend this or whatever we wanted to do. So Command and Control Z to undo that. And we're ready to add some more details. We can also scale out from that as well by hitting T for scale. So super helpful to, adjust axis centers if you need to. So we have our scene organized really nicely so far. Marie Kondo would be very impressed with us, all of our organizational skills. And this is very important because what we're going to be doing is throwing a lot more objects in our scene. So it's important as we go, we organize everything, we group things together, we name things correctly, or we'll absolutely lose track of what's what in our scene. So as we build out the roof, we're going to be creating a lot more objects. So we're going to start by creating a little triangular bit like this. And I am sorry, I again apologize for my skills here. The little triangular bit here, we're going to create all these little like clay tile, roof tiles that you see on a lot of Japanese buildings and architecture. And what we're going to also do is build out some little flags here that we can put little logos on or something. And then a nice little support bit there, and that's basically it. So let's get going, and I'll delete that terrible drawing. Let's get our move tool and let's start building out that triangular bit of our roof. So to do that, I'm going to dive into my primitives menu again. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab a cylinder. You might be wondering, why are we grabbing a cylinder here? Let's just move this up. And what I'm actually going to do is lay this flat. So like this, and this is actually the dead center of the radius of our cylinder. So I'm just going to move this up on the Y, constraining to the y-axis. So this is about aligned with the base of the roof. And how we're going to turn this into a triangular piece is utilizing the rotation segments here. So again, height segments we really don't need, and we can bring down this rotation segments, and you'll see we have this little triangular bit. Now this is upside down from where we need it, so all we need to do is just change the orientation and flop that up like that. And then what we can also do to flatten this out is go over to the coordinates, because remember, we also have our scale options here. So just like a shape layer, you have your shape properties or your object properties, and then you have your actual layer, position, scale, and rotation. And so here we can go into the scale Y and just kind of shrink this down a little bit. Maybe 0.3 looked pretty good. And then we can just move this on up. And let's actually make this a little bit bigger. So let's bring up the radius to about like 110. Let's try that on. That looks pretty good. Move this up. And I think that's looking pretty nice. Okay. So now what we can do is we can add some fillet. So we'll go fill it up. And we're just going to make this a little bit rounded there. So if I zoom in here, you can see what that looks like. We're just adding a little bit of rounding there. If we add some more segments in that rounding, you can see that is going to make this nice and sharp, like so. And I'm liking that so far. Now let's go ahead and rename this to the roof.triangle, because I don't have any other words to describe what that is. And now what we can do is just create some nice angled roof pieces that we can lay our ceramic tiles on top of. So for that, we're just going to grab a cube here. Let's move this on up, and let's make this a little flat. Move this on over here, and let's actually rotate this. I'm gonna hit the R key to bring up the rotation bands, and I'm just gonna constrain this to rotate around the X axis here. And let's just hold the shift key down to constrain to increments of about 5 degrees, and 25 looks like that is looking pretty good. And actually that's not perfect, so let's just rotate a little bit more, and we might have to go into our cube here, our coordinates, and it looks like a nice round number of 28 degrees is going to do the trick there. And now we can just kind of position this into space, again, using the axis handles to move along the constrained axes here. And I would say that's looking pretty good. And actually it looks like this isn't perfectly rotated right, so we can just rotate that a little bit more. And it looks like, is it 27? Nope. Looks like we're going to have to hold the Alt or Option key down and click and drag to get that fine-tune detail there. So 27.5, I hate the decimal, but that looks like that's pretty dead on there. And let's go and let's just make this roof dot flat piece. I don't know. And let's just go to Object and turn on the fillet for this as well. Make that nice and rounded. We'll bring down the fillet radius, maybe just put in a value of 1. And that's looking pretty good. And maybe we'll just bring this up a little bit so it's not intersecting this little bit right down here. And maybe make this a little thicker. Something like that looks pretty good. And now what I'm going to do is Command or Control click and drag to duplicate that roof flat bit. And what I'm going to do is want to rotate this to go on the other side. Now, if I rotate this and I try to rotate this all willy-nilly like, you're going to see that we're going to get our rotation all out of whack. So I'm going to Command or Control Z to undo that. And what we're going to do to be able to rotate this around the y-axis here is by going into our world coordinate system. And again, this is going to change from the local coordinate system where we have our cube a little off axis, rotated a little bit. And we're actually going to go to the world coordinate system here. And this will allow us to just rotate this along the y-axis here. So if I hold the shift key down and we go a full 180 degrees like so, I can hit the E key and you'll see we'll be back into our local coordinates. So when we go from each tool, we'll have to turn on the world or object axis coordinates for each individual tool. So rotation, that's already at the world. But if I go to move tool, I'll need to turn on the world coordinate system again. And the shortcut key for that is W. So if I go and hit W and I'm in my world coordinate system, I can hold the shift key down and just move this along the Z-axis here. And that actually looks pretty good, right like that. Now I can make sure that this is aligned perfectly along the Z-axis here by grabbing both of these objects here just by holding the shift key down and selecting this other cube here. And what I can do is see where is this axis center. Let's go up to our 4-up view. where is this axis center on the Z? And you can see that we're slightly, this green line right here, if you follow it up, this is the center of our scene, and you can see our axis center slightly off. So again, when we select multiple objects, we're going to get an average of where those two objects are as the axis center here. So if we want to move this over, we can precisely move this to the 0 centimeters along the Z by just going to our little manager down here, our coordinate manager. And this is where our selected objects live in 3D space. So you can see we actually need to zero out this Z value. So if I hit 0 and enter, you can see that this is now perfectly aligned along the Z. So that's just a simple way to align things in space. And so this is looking good so far. Let's get to making the clay tiles. So for that, I'm gonna go and I'm just gonna grab a tube. We're not gonna grab a cylinder because a tube actually has that hole in the middle of it. So let's go and grab one of those. And we'll just move this into place, again, using the axis handles here. And we need to rotate this a different way. So let's go and let's actually close out of that coordinate manager there to free up some space. And let's have this in the positive Z. And now we can adjust these little handles here to make this a little clay roof tile like so. And let's bring up the object tab here if you didn't have it open. Let's just put in some smaller values here. So let's go about 10 centimeters for the outer radius. Then for the inner radius, let's call that about 8. And that's looking pretty good. And then for the height, let's bring this down to, let's call it 30 centimeters like so. And you can see that this is fairly chunky here. So let's up the rotation segments. And then while we're at it, let's get out of our world coordinate system, go back to our local coordinate system here. Now we need to kind of slice this in half. So there's this aptly named slice tab here that we can go into, and we can slice this in half, or we can just kind of adjust the to and from amount to slice this any way we want. Slice and dice and make julienne fries with it. And what we can do is we need to actually have this orientated upside down or the other way around. So we'll go and we're not going to rotate. We're just going to change the orientation here to negative Z. And now we're facing the right direction. So now what we can do is we can rotate this downward. So hit the R key. And again, we're in the world coordinate system. So I'll just get back to local and let's just go along this Y-axis band here. And just click and drag, and we'll just rotate this about 20 degrees. And so we just want this slightly angled, and then we'll move this down and move this forward like so. So I would say that's looking pretty good. Now let's go and let's create a whole bunch more of these. Or actually not a whole bunch, but just a few more to fill out the tiles as it goes to the top of the roof here. And how we're gonna do that is by using that duplicate tool again. So before we duplicate this object, let's first rename it. So this will be a clay tile. And now we can, with this object selected, go to Tools, Duplicate. And for this, we're not gonna use circle, we're gonna use linear, okay? And we need to, again, hit Apply. And you can see what's happening here. If I just zoom out, you can see that we are duplicating these objects linearly, moving them 50 centimeters. So every 50 centimeters in the Y, it'll create a copy. So we actually don't want to do that. So this move is X, Y, and Z. So we don't need to move this much in the Y. So we'll bring this down, maybe 10 centimeters, but we do need to move this in the Z. So we'll just increase the Z value here to maybe 20, and let's add one more copy. So I'll just up the copy there, and that's looking pretty good. And one thing I forgot to do is create some rounding for the clay tile. So what I can do is, and this is really, really cool, is before we were just cloning and creating other tube objects, but what we can do is change the clone mode from copies to instance or render instance. And what this is going to do is create a new object that's going to reference our original tube object that we can adjust, and it'll update all the other instances that we have. And a render instance is basically just a more RAM optimized version of that. I won't really get into the details of that too much, but for our instance, we're going to use render instance. And when we do that, and I twirl down the null here, you'll see that this didn't just generate more tubes. this created these instant objects. And if we select them, you can see that the reference object is this clay tile. Now, I forgot to turn on the fillet for this clay tile here. So if I go and turn on fillet, you'll notice that that change cascaded through all of these instance objects because they're always referencing this original object, which is super cool. So now I can go and I can adjust this radius to maybe like 0.7, and that's looking pretty good. And that is looking nice now. And so if I adjust any of these other properties here, that's just gonna update all of these other instances. Now, if I hit my move tool and I move this up, that's one thing that won't translate over. So it's not gonna translate over any of the coordinate information here. So if I adjust the rotation, it's not going to translate. But if I adjust anything in the object tab or the slice here, that will cascade to all the instances, okay? So here I'll rename this clay tile group. And then I'm just going to move this clay tile underneath that group null. So we have all those grouped together. And another thing I'm going to do is right where this clay tile is, I want to put a cylinder as a nice little end cap there. So to do that, I'm just going to grab my cylinder, and with that clay tile selected, I'll hold the Command or Control key down, and that will place that cylinder right exactly where the axis center of that clay tile tube was. And now we can just hit T for scale. Let's shrink this down. Let's go to the Object tab. Let's change the orientation to +Z, and we'll just scale this down a little bit more, move this outward, and let's just add a fillet cap there. And that's looking nice and rounded there. And let's up the rotation segments. We can get rid of the height segments. And this is just like a nice end cap here for our clay tile. Okay, so there's our clay tile group. Let's double click on the cylinder and name this just cap. And now we can fold this up and we can move this along the Z axis here. I'll hold the shift key down to constrain in increments of 5 centimeters, move that down to 90 centimeters, and that's about the end there. And what we can do again, maybe move this forward slightly, is we can now duplicate this row of clay tiles and fill out the rest of this roof here. So to grab the duplicate tool again, since we just used it recently, we don't have to go up to our tools menu here. We can actually click and hold on this little gizmo here, and this stores your last few tools that you used. So I used the duplicate tool, so I'll just come here. I don't have to go up here and dig through the duplicate tool. I can just grab it here, and you'll see that we can now use this linear mode again. We can still use the render instances here if we want to, and I'm just gonna hit apply. And now what we can do is let's zoom out, and we just need to move this not along the Z and not along the Y, so I'll zero that out. We just need to move this along the X here. And we need to create a few more copies here to fill out the roof. And like so, we just duplicated that group of clay tiles and just created the whole top front side of our roof, which is really cool. So here's our clay roof tile copies. Again, they are all instances. So if I change anything, if I hit the E key and move this, you can see now the position changes will update there. But if I move anything here, this will update across all those other group tiles there, which is super, super cool. So if I place this clay tile group underneath here, what I want to do is if I select this group null, the axis center is way over here. What I actually want to do is let's select all these objects, and we'll have the axis center again be averaged out between all the selected objects. So we'll have like a centered axis center. So with all those objects selected, I'll hit Alt or Option G to group those tiles together. And this will be clay tile.group. And this will be the front of the clay tile roof. And let's actually just rename this roof instead of group. There we go. And so I'll just move this outside of this null, delete that existing null. And so now this null, it has the axis center right there. And we can go into our axis modification tool here. Again, you can accidentally hit L and actually have that turned on. So if you're like moving something and it's just moving the axis, that's probably why you accidentally have that on. And so we can just move this on up and just center that and just eyeball it, just moving that up the Z axis there. And I'll hit L to deactivate the axis modification tool. And voila, we got this really cool roof going on here. Move that up a little bit. So we got the front side of the roof. Let's duplicate this the same way we duplicated the flat roof bits here. And that is by command clicking and dragging to duplicate the roof group. And then here is, we can rename this to back. And then again, we'll go into our world coordinate system and let's grab the rotation tool here. And again, we have to go to the world coordinate system with the rotation tool, and I'll rotate this along the Y-axis, hold the shift key down, rotate this a full 180 degrees. I'll hit E to get the move tool, again, making sure we're in the world coordinate system. And I'll just move this along the Z, holding the shift key down, and voila, we just moved this 95 centimeters. And again, I can select both these objects, and let's see if they're aligned to the Z-axis 0 centimeters there. So I'll go down here, and you can see we're slightly off. So if I go to my right view again, you can see here's the dead center of our scene. We're slightly off here, so I'll just zero out the Z, and that will align this perfectly down the Z-axis there. So awesome. And that's looking good. So let's just go ahead and top this off with a nice little support beam here on the top of the roof. So I'll just create a cube. We'll go pretty fast here because we know how to do all of this stuff here. So just a cube, make this stick out a little bit. Let's add some fillet. Let's go 2.5 or even less than that. And this will just be roof support. And let's maybe flatten this out. So this is just kind of covering the fact that our geometry is intersecting there. So get creative with like how you hide your intersection by adding nice little details like this. And so there's the other support there. And now what we can do is duplicate the support, and let's make this a side support, like a beam, side support beam. And I'll just move this to the side here, shrink this down. And this is, again, just a simple support beam here, just to add some nice little detail. Let's maybe bring down the fillet radius to 1 centimeter. And we'll just do something like this. Have this go all the way down like so. That's looking pretty good. And now if I want to duplicate this onto the other side, I'm going to actually pay attention to where this is on the X-axis. So this is basically just 98 centimeters, so I'll just round that up. Again, rounding things is actually super helpful, especially in times like this, because if we want this beam to be on the opposite side of this ramen restaurant and everything's built symmetrically, what I can do is just command click and drag to duplicate this support beam. And instead of being in the positive X 98 centimeters, I can simply just go and just plug in, if I just arrow key over and type in negative and enter, you'll see that that just moved this to the other side, the negative side of X. And so we got the support beam here, looking pretty good. And that's looking great. Now what we can do is build out those flags. So I'm going to command click and drag to duplicate this roof base here. Make it something like this. Let's reduce the rounding there. So I'm basically just creating a structure that our flags can hang off of here. Something like this. Like so. And let's actually duplicate this roof base. And actually, let's rename this roof base because this is just the flag base. And I'll command click and drag to duplicate that. And this will just be a flag. So I'll just make this, shrink this down, move this downwards like so. And we'll make this super skinny. So if I go to my objects tab, let's make the fillet radius like 0.1. And let's shrink this down in the Z. So maybe 1 centimeter, and let's see how, you'll notice if I bring this down, it zeroes out the fillet radius, because if you have no depth, you can't have any radius or rounding on that depth. So if I change this back to 1 and crank this up, that's about as far as it can go with that small of a thickness there. So that looks pretty good. And let's just change this. Let's just round out these values. So in the size, let's go 40. I'll tab down. Let's do 35 and hit enter. And I'll just move this down and move this on over like so. And then to duplicate these flags, well, again, let's actually get out of our world coordinate system because I just saw that highlighted. Let's go back to our duplicate tool. And again, we'll duplicate this linearly. So again, let's get out of our coordinate manager. Let's hit apply. We don't need 9 copies. Let's just create 3 copies. And let's just move this 45 centimeters. And let's just move this on down into the flag group null. And again, I'll get my move tool and let's just kind of center this up here like so. And since we have instances on, we can adjust this original flag and that will update there as well. But I think that's looking pretty good. And if we wanted to, we could select all these flag objects here, Alt or Option G, and we'll create that null right in the dead center of all these objects. So I'll delete that old null, flag group. And now we can go into that coordinates manager again. And we need this to be kind of aligned right at X 0 centimeters. And you can see in our coordinate manager, we're slightly off again. So here's the dead center. We're just slightly off. So let's just zero that out in the X. And now this is perfectly aligned. Another thing that's great about having the axis center right in the center is we can scale this down by hitting T and scale everything down from the center. So it's very important, just like in Photoshop or Illustrator or After Effects, where your axis center is, because that's where you'll rotate from and that's where you'll scale from. So with that, we have our roof built and some nice flags up the front there. Let's actually group all of these roof objects together. So the roof base as well, just hold the Control or Command key down to add to our selection there. And let's hit Alt or Option G to group those objects together. I'll rename this null roof.group. And there we go. All right, so let's model some stools for the front of our ramen restaurant here. So the first thing we can do is let's create an actual ground floor here. So we just have the floor of our ramen restaurant, but we actually need a ground object here. So I'll just hit T for scale, scale this on up, and let's go to our 4-up view. And let's just make sure that our ground is flush to the ramen restaurant floor. So that's looking pretty good. And let's add a little bit of fillet rounding there as well. Make this rounding 2.5. So now we just simply have a floor that we can put some stools on. So I'll just rename this to ground. I can even move this down in our object manager here just to have the floor and the ground and everything close together visually. And let's go and maximize our perspective view. So now we can start to model out our stool. So let's go ahead and for the top of the stool, we can create a cylinder here. And so I'm just going to move this out and shrink this down. And you can see that, this is a little hard because we have all these objects here. There's a lot of stuff cluttering our scene. So one thing we can do to just focus on this single stool here is as I'm adjusting this and just kind of getting the scale correct for how I want this to look, what I can do is I can use a solo feature to just solo this object that I am working with. And to do that, I'm just going to click this little button right here. This is the viewport solo button with the little eyeball. If I click that, it's going to only show in my viewport the object that I had selected and nothing else. So now what I can do is I can remove those height segments. I can up the rotation segments a little bit. I can turn on the fillet to add that nice little bit of rounding, make this look like a nice cushioned seat there. Maybe up the rotation segments a little bit as well. And there we go. I'm focusing just on this singular object here. So what I can do at this point is I can get out of solo by clicking this button again, and I can go ahead and create the legs of the stool. So let's go ahead and let's rename this cylinder by double clicking on it and naming this stool seat. I'll command click and drag this, and I'll just name this stool leg. Okay. And what I can do is adjust the radius here. And you can see it's hard to grab these little dots here, but that's totally cool because we can go into the radius here and adjust things that way. And again, this is kind of hard to kind of see and select because you can accidentally select the back object here. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to select both of these objects, so the stool seat and stool leg, holding the Control key down, adding to my selection, selecting the other object. Now I can go and click on the solo again, and now I'm just highlighting and soloing both those objects, and I can adjust these objects as much as I want here. And I don't know exactly where the floor is just now, but if I go and unsolo I can make this flush to the floor. Something like that. Move the stool down a little bit, and I can select both of these objects in the viewport by holding the shift key down, adding to my selection, and then going to solo again. And basically what we can do is create 4 of these legs, or actually 3 more of these legs, by using that duplicate tool again. So let's go to tools, duplicate, and we're not going to go linear. We're going to go back to circle again. And I'm just going to hit apply, and you'll see that the radius is too big. So I'll bring the radius down. And that's looking pretty good. Let's maybe make the radius a little bit wider. So maybe 14 looks pretty good. So I'm going to choose render instance, and this is looking pretty good. And so now we got this nice stool there. Now let's add one more support. And so to do that, I'm going to go and I'm going to select the stool seat here. And I want an object to be created right at this axis center again. So to create the nice stool support system there, I'm going to go and grab a torus. So again, I'm going to hold down the Command or Control key, release my mouse, hit T for scale, and this object is exactly appearing at the same axis center of that stool seat that I had selected there. So I'm going to hit E for my move tool, move this down, and here is the option for, if I select the torus, make sure the object tab's visible, and you can see I'm adjusting the pipe radius there. Get this middle dot there, I'm adjusting the ring radius. And then just like we went and removed segments to simplify that roof triangle, we can do the same thing here. I'm going to adjust the, not the pipe segments, we'll leave that the same, but if I reduce the ring segments here to 4, you can see that actually works pretty nicely. So we got this nice kind of support right there. And so I'll just rename this stool support. And then so what I can do is just move all these objects. I'm just holding the Command or Control key to select both these objects. And I can just move this underneath that stool leg support, and I can just rename this to stool. And so this whole time we've been in this solo mode. If I desolo by clicking this button again, you can see there's our single stool, which is looking really nice. And so I can move this on over. And maybe I decide, you know what, this is a little bit too tall. Let me go to the stool leg, and we can just shrink down that height. And since we used instances, that's going to update everything there. Now we can just select all these stool legs and move this up and move the overall stool down like so. So now we can duplicate this single stool 2 more times using that same method. So tools, duplicate. Instead of circle, we'll go linear again, hit apply, and we'll just copy this 2 times, and we'll still use render instances. And I'll just move this down to, say, let's do 60. It's a nice round number. And so now you'll see there's the stool copies there. I'll just actually move the stool underneath the stool copies, hit E to get my move tool back. And if we wanted to center this right along the middle of the x-axis here, again, we'll go down to the coordinate manager here, and you can see we're just slightly off center from being on 0 centimeters in the X. So I'll just zero that out, and you'll see how with all those objects selected, we are now perfectly aligned down the X-axis. And again, since we made these instances here, I can change anything in this first stool, like the seat, and everything else will update. So this is really, really nice. If I want to change literally anything about this object, these objects, I can, and all those changes will cascade down. So super cool little system there. I'll select all these stool legs to move them up, because if I just select the first stool leg and move it up, those coordinate changes don't cascade down, only the object property changes. So if you want to move everything up and down, you'll need to actually select all those objects and move them up and down. But again, if I change something here, like the caps to 1.5, that will update along everything there. So this is looking really, really nice. Got all of our stools here. And I'll just rename this stool.group. And let's remember to save. Now, one quick note about the whole solo tool here. You might, if you are working with a group of the stools or anything that's underneath a null, you might select that stool group and say, okay, I want to just solo all 3 of these stools. You would go and select that null. You would select the solo button here, and you'll see that actually nothing's showing up. The only thing that's happening is you're soloing that null. And a null is just an empty layer, just like in After Effects. So there's no objects in a null. It's just a little access placeholder. Now, if we actually wanted to solo everything underneath it in the hierarchy, we would need to go to this button right next to it. And we would need to go and click and hold and say, actually, when we are soloing, we want to solo the object we selected plus the hierarchy. So that means all of the objects underneath it. And so when we select that, you can see that, okay, now when we solo, we are soloing, and with the hierarchy active, we are actually soloing all the objects underneath that null in that hierarchy. Okay, so very important when soloing things and trying to organize everything using the solo. It's very important when you're wanting to say, highlight just that roof group, solo that, and you can see we just soloed that as well. All right, so we got our ramen restaurant coming along. We just don't have any ramen. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's create some bowls of ramen. And so previously I was showing you how we can create objects. We can use this solo to isolate objects to focus on them. But there's actually another way we can do this, and that is by utilizing the ability that Cinema 4D has, where you can have multiple projects open, which means that you can copy and paste elements between separate projects. So to create a new project, I'm going to go and just hit this plus sign up here. You can see this almost looks like a web browser. If you hit the plus sign, it's going to create a new tab. This new tab is a new project. Okay, so now I can still have this project open. Remember to save early, save often. But now with that open, I can create this whole new project and again, copy and paste elements between them. So let's create our ramen bowl. So I'm just going to go and let's create a sphere. Now we haven't messed with the sphere yet, but you can see there's only a few options here. You got the radius, segments, and type. Now, if we adjust the radius and the segments, you know what those do. But the type is basically a bunch of different ways to subdivide a sphere. But the thing that we're going to pay attention to for the ramen bowl is using this hemisphere. And when we choose type hemisphere, you can see that if I just orbit underneath, you can see it's an upside down bowl. So let's actually rotate this bowl so it's facing upright. So I'll just hit the R key to bring the rotation tool, hover over the Z axis band, hold the shift key down as I'm clicking and dragging, and rotate it 100 degrees. And I'll hit the E key to get the move tool. I can even hover over the Y axis and just move this on up so it's not intersecting with that world grid down there. And we got a bowl. Now you can see that it's pretty thin. It's got no thickness to it. But I'm going to introduce you really quickly, really briefly, to 2 major tool sets in Cinema 4D. And one is a concept called generators. And what generators do is they're color-coded green over here. And if I go to this menu here and click and hold, basically what I want to do is I want to generate more geometry to thicken the sphere. And generators generate geometry based on objects you put into them. So they're very aptly named, and they're color-coded green here. You can see that the instance we were using before to instance those stools, that is also a type of generator object. So you feed one object into it, it generates geometry based on that geometry, okay? So if I go and I choose thicken, you can see nothing happens because we haven't built a relationship between the sphere and this generator. So as I said before, to have a generator generate geometry off of a specific object, we need to place it or feed that object into that generator. And how we can do that is by selecting the sphere, clicking and dragging, and you'll see that if I highlight that thicken generator, there's that downward arrow. If I release my mouse, you'll see that that just made that a child of that thicken object, and immediately you'll see that we just thickened this object. We generated that thickness using this thicken generator. And you can see just like our sphere, this generator has a bunch of different options. So you can, in this object tab, adjust the thickness here. And I'm not going to get into too many of these details, but I just want to introduce the concept of generators to you, that you basically feed objects into it and it generates geometry. So we just wanted to thicken this bowl. And what we can also do is, just like we had the cube and we have this fillet, you have that radius, we actually want to create some rounding on this sphere as well. You can see there's no options for that on this sphere as it stands. So what we can do is use something called a deformer. So we have generators, and we also have deformers, which are these objects right here. And you can see these are all color-coded purple. And basically what these are, think of them as After Effects effects or Photoshop effects. You need to apply them to an existing layer or existing geometry. So unlike generators where you need to feed objects into them, deformers actually need geometry to deform. So let's go all the way down here. Let's just grab a bevel deformer. And you can see that when we added this to our scene, nothing happens because again, we need to create that relationship between the bevel deformer and this sphere. And to do that with a deformer, we don't need to feed the object into the bevel deformer. We actually need to just place this bevel deformer as a child of the thicken. And as this is the same level of hierarchy as the sphere, you can see that this is now active. And if I want to see these effects turned off, I can just check on that checkbox there, that green check mark, to turn them off, and you'll see we're just left with our original sphere. So if I turn on the thicken, turn on the bevel, you can see what's happening. Now, if I select the bevel deformer, you can see there's a whole bunch of options here. The only options you need to worry about are this offset and the subdivision. So subdivisions like adding segments, and this offset is just how big is that fillet or how big is that bevel. And you can see that's pretty chunky. So we can add segments to it or subdivisions to smooth that out. So we can do that right here. And so if we add 3 subdivisions with an offset of 2, we can just click off of that. That looks really, really nice. So generators and deformers are 2 big concepts that we'll cover throughout the rest of this course. So don't feel overwhelmed by them just yet because I'm just introducing the concepts to you. We'll cover deformers and generators in depth much more throughout this course. So what we can do now is let's just go and let's group all these objects together. So Command and Alt G, and this will just be bowl. Okay. So now we can start filling the bowl with, say, broth and all the ingredients. So let's go ahead and to create the broth, we're just going to go and we'll grab a cylinder. And I'll just make this a little bit bigger radius, shrink this down a little bit. Let's add some more segments here in the cylinder. Go to the Object tab, add some segments. We don't need height segments other than 1. Let's add a fillet just to round that out a little bit. Hit T for scale, just move this down in the Y. That's looking pretty good. Let's, again, because that's a little bit chunky, the edges there, let's just add a few more rotation segments and let's just rename this broth. Now let's go and let's add some more objects here. So let's go and let's create a torus. And we can use a torus, if I scale this down, for some noodles. So let's just go and we'll bring down the ring radius there, and I'm just going to rotate this and move this on down. And you can get creative with, how you use these primitive objects to give the illusion of certain things. So if I go and if I'm on the highlighting the YX axis here and hit Control or Command, click and drag, I can duplicate this a few times, and there I got 3 tori that kind of look like little ramen noodles. And I can select all these objects, go to the Basic tab, go to the name, and just name these noodles. And what I can do with these 3 objects selected is I can Command, click, and drag, and I can hover over the little corner here for the YX plane and duplicate those again. Hit R and just kind of rotate these around. Hit the E key for the Move tool. And just kind of, fold these in. And that looks kind of cool. I can select all these noodles, holding the Shift key and selecting all of them. And I can rotate these even more and, position them wherever I choose. So something like this. And so what I can do at this point, maybe scale everything up a little bit, move this down. Kind of looks like noodles from afar, right? And so what I can do at this point is let's grab a sphere, shrink this down. I love ramen with egg in them, so I'm going to just kind of scale this down. And to make this look like an oval, I'm going to go to the sphere, go to the Object tab. Let's just increase the segments a little bit. And let's go to the coordinates. And remember how we can kind of adjust the scale in the X, Y, and Z independently. And so I can just bring up the scale in the X, to 1.25 and kind of rotate this around. And all of a sudden, voila, we have an egg looking pretty good. And we can rename this sphere to egg. Then I always like to have big, medium, and small details. So we got the big bowl, medium-sized noodles, and egg. And what we can do is create some small little scallions. So I'll create a torus, scale this down, little green onions, I guess, or Cheerios. If you put Cheerios in your ramen, that's gross. Just me saying that. But nice little details in there. Let me rename this torus to green onion, not Cheerios. And I'll just command, click, and drag to duplicate that. Scale it up, command, click, and drag, duplicate it again. And we got some nice little details. Now we can really get a little more detailed in here. You can command, click, and drag the broth. And we can make that little fish cake. And basically that's just kind of rotating this off to the side like so. I like my ramen with tons of stuff in it. I don't know about you. We'll put that fish cake in there, which is a little gross. A fish cake doesn't sound like a cake I want on my birthday, but let's just move this out of the way. And so there is our fish cake. That looks tasty. All right, so how are we gonna eat this ramen? Well, we need some chopsticks, right? So let's go and create some chopsticks really quick. And for that, we'll go and we will create a cone. Now, we haven't messed with a cone yet either, so we're getting some new primitives in here. So if I go to the Object tab of the cone, and let's actually just close this coordinate manager here. It's kind of taking up some space, so I'll just click off that button to hide it. And this cone, you can see if I kind of rotate this and have this kind of look like it's kind of stabbing going into our ramen bowl here. You can see the cone has, again, its own unique primitive settings. So we have this bottom radius right there. And then the top radius, which because I rotated this backwards, the top is actually the bottom. So let's fix that. Let's do this the right way, shall we? All right, so we got the top radius right there. The bottom radius, which should be skinnier than the top radius if we are building a chopstick here. And then here is the overall height. As you can see, that's updating there. And so we can just have this chopstick like so. And let's round this out. You know the drill. You know the drill. Let's do 150, round everything out. And then for the caps, we'll create that rounding here, that fillet. And even though it doesn't say fillet here, it says it down here. So these are basically turning on the fillets for the top and the bottom here. So let me actually just move this on out. And you can see as I activate the bottom, that's the bottom right there. There's the controls for that bottom fillet. And then for the top, you can see that activated the top fillet right there as well. And you can see, if I zoom in, you can see there's the radius and the height. This is the radius and this is the height. So we have a lot of control over the rounding here on this cone object or this chopstick. So now I can rotate this into place. And this is where, if you want to position something in 3D space, pretty good to go into your 4-up view. So that's F5 shortcut key. And you can kind of look at, is this resting on its side there? Something like that. I'd say that's looking pretty good. And let's rename this to chopstick. And we'll command click and drag to duplicate the chopstick. And we'll just kind of move this. And I'll select both of these and move them out of the way of the egg so they're not kind of puncturing the egg. But I can also just move the egg here as well. Move the scallion. Just going to move this along that ZX plane. And let's actually move this so we have a lot of detail showing right there. And you can see these chopsticks are just kind of floating. So attention to detail. Let's make sure these kind of rest on the edge there. That's looking pretty good. Don't want intersections either. So just kind of rotate that around like so. And we can select these and rotate them individually, move them up and down the local Y-axis there. And that's looking really good. That's looking super tasty. Let's go ahead and now that we're done, let's group all of these objects together. So I'll just select, click and drag to get a rectangle selection. select all these objects together. And you can see that the axis center's kind of off. So this is actually an instance where we don't want to group all these objects together by selecting all the objects, because some objects are off axis, so we're not getting the grouped axis here. But what we can do is we can actually place everything underneath the bowl. So let's select all these objects, place them underneath the bowl null, like so. And now this is ramen bowl. And if we wanted to, we could group this back underneath just a null named bowl again. So Alt or Option G, and we'll just name this bowl. Okay, so both of these bowls share the same axis center, and there we go. And if we really wanted to, we can even go into enable axis modification and drag this down a little bit. And actually, while I'm thinking of it, we actually have some of our ramen here intersecting the bottom of the bowl. So we'll just adjust that. And let's actually have this, if we actually set this on a table, this would roll right off. So let's give this a nice little bottom here, a flat bottom, so this doesn't roll off the table. So let's just grab a cylinder real quick, make that a child of the ramen bowl, and let's just quickly shrink this down. So a nice base to the bowl, like so. And let's go to the cylinder. Let's add a fillet. Let's add some rotation segments. And if we really wanted to get fancy, we could add some like lining to this bowl too. So let's make this base, and let's grab yet another torus. And once you get the hang of all the navigation and everything, this is where you can really start to get super quick and agile with some of this stuff. So this is literally, I'll just make this a child. This is just basically like accents, like bowl accents. Okay. So think of like, lines, little decorations on the edge of the bowl there, looking pretty good. Make them super small, super subtle. We can drag, make another one. So just something like that, I think works pretty well. Nice little bowl accents. And now we got our ramen bowl. So we just spent a lot of time bashing all these objects together to create this nice little ramen bowl here in a separate scene. So we made everything nice and manageable. How do we get this over to our main scene? Well, let's go to our ramen bowl here, and I'm just going to hit Command or Control C, and then I'm just going to go over into our ramen restaurant here in Command or Control V, and you can see that we have a pretty giant ramen bowl, but we can hit T for scale this down, and just kind of place this right on top of the surface there, okay? Like so. And we can command, click, and drag to duplicate this, because I don't know about you, but I need my own ramen bowl. I don't like to share my ramen or my food, so I'm just going to create another bowl of ramen there. We can rotate this, and basically we can kind of just change things up a bit to make this look a little more unique. So I can select all these ramen noodles there. And if you go to your world coordinate system there, if you just rotate, you can see you can rotate this around like so. And so now we have, different looking ramen bowls looking a little unique. Maybe there's not even a fish cake in this one because they're gross to some people. I don't know. I'm fine with them, but they might be gross to some people. If you're a vegetarian, you don't want those in your ramen. And you'll notice that I'm still in my world axis here. So again, if I turn this off and I rotate things, that's local axis. This is world axis. So if I select both these objects, I can rotate both of them at once. So you got two tasty ramen bowls here sitting right on the counter, and we can even duplicate this ramen bowl, move this along the YZ axis here, move this along the XZ axis here, and this can kind of just be an empty bowl, okay? So we'll rename this empty bowl. So again, we want to build up our scene with some details. So for that, we'll just, basically, we will select the green onions. I'm just holding the Control or Command key down to add to my selection. So all the noodles and the broth. Delete. And there we go. We got our nice little empty bowl. Nice little detail. We can even duplicate this again. And this could be a soy sauce bowl. And move this, shrink this down. And for this, we remove these accent lines, remove the chopsticks, and maybe even make the base a little thicker. And this is your soy sauce bowl. And you can, place this, duplicate it wherever you'd like. You move this next to our ramen bowl over here. And maybe there is actually some soy sauce in there. So we'll duplicate this base right there. Make this a little bigger. And it's thinner. And so this is our soy sauce. So you can see how you can easily populate your scene. And again, I moved these noodles too far out that we got noodles intersecting the bowl there. So I'll just move this out of the way. So it's always important to look at your 3D scene from all different angles to see if things are kind of intersecting anywhere, anything looks weird, because you might be building from one angle and everything looks like garbage from the other angle. So it's important to look around, also to use your 4-up views when things are getting a little unwieldy to see if anything's intersecting each other. But this is looking pretty good. This is looking pretty appetizing. If I walk past this place, I would, my mouth would be watering quite a bit. Let's save and let's move on. All right, so we're just going to time lapse the rest of it. I won't bore you with doing the same repetitive stuff, but you can see I'm just using primitives as we were before, making bottles, making cups, and just, again, populating our scene with some detail. Now, what I'm doing here is I just broke out into a new project again, just like we did with the ramen bowl. I'm just making a sign. So when you have a little bit more of a complex object, I always like to bust out into a new project and just focus on that, and then copy and paste it into the main project, and there you go. All right, so let's slow this down a bit because I want to show you a really cool tool that will help you place objects in your scene. So you can see this sign that I just built. It's just hovering on the floor there. It's not actually in contact. So what I can do to fix this is use the place tool. And what the place tool does, if I select it, you'll see our axis rotation bands turned into this purpley rotation band and this little block that indicates scale. And this scales this up and down, and this will rotate the object. But if I want to place this object along any surface, I just need to click and drag the object. And you can see as I scroll around here, I'm placing the sign on the stool, on the side here. But this is really cool because it detects surfaces and you can place this object along any surface. I can place this sign on the roof if I wanted to. So this is a very cool tool that with just one single tool, you can place, scale, and rotate in your scene. And this is what you can do to help you populate the scene even more with, say we wanted to select the soy sauce bowl. And if I try to move this, you'll see that I only selected the one element, the one object in this null group. So I'm going to undo that and I'm going to make sure I select the null, which will allow me to select all of the objects underneath that null. And I can command click and drag and create a duplicate of that soy sauce bowl. And I can just move this object along like so, maybe place it right there. And you'll see that when I command clicked and dragged, it automatically created an instance of that soy sauce bowl, which is totally fine. We're used to dealing with instances here. There's one thing I do want to show you though, and let's just select this stool, for example. So the stool group, if I just move this, you can see what that does. But if I want to just select one of these stools and move this, there might be occasions where you select an object and if you didn't model it correctly, your y-axis might be facing a different way or your axes might be totally different. So when you select this, it might actually have the object go sideways. And let me just illustrate this really quick. So I'm going to bring up the tool options again by going to the place tool here. And here's the place tool options. And so let me just demonstrate what might happen when you select an object. So let's just do this. And oh, my object, my axes are all messed up on my object. So what's really cool about this is you can actually control the up direction or which direction faces upwards. And so for us, Y was actually upwards, and that's actually made by default. But if you model things where maybe you forgot to, choose Y positive and maybe it's Y negative, you might select an object and it will flip like this. And that's where you would need to adjust which up direction you are using. So in our case, we didn't have to do that, but I just wanted to show you in case you modeled an object on its axis or on its side or anything like that. That's how you can fix it, is using this up direction. So let me just go ahead and undo all those moves right there. Let me just move this soy sauce instance down here like so. And we can start populating more of our scene. All right, so you can see I added a whole bunch more details here. Again, using a lot of the same techniques that I already showed. So be free to use your own imagination and references to build up your own scene, create your own little objects out of these primitives, and have a lot of fun. But this is what I came up with. And all I have left to do is one last little detail, and that is creating a sign that says ramen on it. Okay, so we'll place that right on the roof here. So let's go ahead and let's create the base of the sign. So we're just going to use a cube here, and let's just move this on up like so. Just a simple sign here. We'll move this and rotate this right along there. So it's just kind of sitting right about there. And let's add a bit of fillet or rounding. That looks good with a radius of about 2. And let's rename this sign. And then I'm just going to command click and drag, duplicate this, and just create like a little border here as well. So something along the lines of that. So this is the sign border. And now what we can do is actually create the sign text. So what's really cool about Cinema 4D is that we've been covering all these different primitives, and right here is actually a text primitive. So it's a text object. It automatically creates 3D extruded text. And if I just add this to my scene, there is the text right there. And actually, I forgot what I could do is we can undo that. And if we want the text object to appear right at this axis center of the sign, I can select the sign, get the text tool again, not the text spline. That'll just create a spline or a path, empty path. But this is what will create the 3D extruded text. And I'll hold the Command or Control key down, and there is the text object that appeared right where our axis center is. Now, if we go to the Object tab of our text object, you can see that our text is aligned to the left. If I change this to middle, you can see that our text is now aligned to the middle of our object's axis center there. And then all I got to do is just kind of hit T for scale, scale this down, move this forward in Z space, and just kind of place this like so. Now, we don't just want this to say text, but let's actually have this say ramen in the Japanese alphabet, okay? So one thing I'm gonna do is, if you have Creative Cloud, there are these 2 fonts that I really like that are really good for Japanese fonts. They support Japanese characters, and it's this Ruika and this M+ rounded. So all you got to do is on your Creative Cloud desktop app, just go and make sure you install those. And then once you install those on your computer, be sure to restart Cinema 4D. If you don't restart, these activated fonts won't show up. But once you do that, we're going to go to the text here, and they should now show up. There's the Ruika, and then there's the rounded. And let's do the rounded M+. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to get some katakana, which is one of the Japanese alphabets. And we're just going to go and search for it in Google. So I just ramen and katakana, and this just came up right away with the first result. And so this has ramen spelled in 2 different Japanese alphabets. So one in hiragana, which is this one, and then one in katakana, which is this one. And so we're learning a little bit about Japanese language here for the alphabets. So I'm just going to go and grab all of these text right there. So ramen, and then copy, and then go back into Cinema 4D. There's the text object selected. And in the text spline, I'm just going to select this and hit Command or Control V to paste. And there is our text spline. So I just clicked off the text area there, and you can see there are the Japanese characters right there. So we can adjust the height here, and we can move this up, hit T for scale, And then just like all the other primitives, we have a little bit of rounding in the caps. So let's go and just up the size. So this is just the size of the bevel there. You can see we have some nice rounding going on there. And this is looking pretty good. Now, you can go into the rabbit hole with the text object. There's different types of horizontal spacing you can use. You can even go and kern. So if you don't know what kerning is, you should, because what it allows you to do, if I check this on, we can actually show the kerning tools here, and we can actually kern by clicking on these little squares here. And this will allow you to kern 3D text. So you can be very designery and kern your text. And that's looking really, really nice. And so what we can do at this point is select all these objects, and let's actually paste the text in there as well. So we'll select all these objects, Alt or Option G to group. And this will just be ramen.sign. And there we go. And we can even put this in the roof group here as well, because it's part of the roof. Like so. And then what we can do as well is I made this other sign here. It's this little flag. And you can see I didn't name things properly. That's my bad. But let me just name this sign. Okay. And what we can do is use the hiragana version of this text right here. Command and Control C to copy this and have that going down this flag. So I'm going to select the sign object here. Let's grab another text object. And we're going to hold the Command or Control key down. You'll see this will be placed right at the axis center of that sign. Let's do middle again. Let's shrink this down, shrink the height. Let's move this forward. And let's adjust the depth here, which is basically just how much we're extruding this, how much that extrude depth is. And then I'm just going to paste in the hiragana. And this looks really good. Instead of the Sugoi, let's do the rounded black again. So let's not make it that thick. Let's just do bold, and that works. And if we want this to read vertically instead of horizontally, what we can do is just hit enter after each of these characters and just have it aligned like this. And then we can adjust the vertical spacing like so. Let's just move this on up here. Shrink this down. Looking good. And I'll just paste the hiragana in that right there. And let's go to caps, adjust the start and end rounding there like so. And that's looking pretty good. Text here was sticking out a little bit too much. We'll just move that in. And maybe I want this to be a little bit more thick. So let's choose the heavy version for that. And that's looking much nicer. I'm digging that. And like so, we got our ramen restaurant with our ramen signage and ready to invite some customers. All right, so as of right now, this all gray restaurant looks like the most depressing place to eat. So let's go ahead, let's add some colors, let's add some materials. Now, when you create objects, there's no materials applied to any object, so that's why everything's this default gray. So before we go ahead and we start adding some materials, what we're going to do is we're going to choose the renderer that we want to use to then render this scene. So unlike After Effects, if we go to our render settings here, so go edit render settings, you'll see there are multiple renderers that we can use. By default, it is set to standard. Now in After Effects, you have one renderer, and that's the After Effects renderer. And when you make something in your comp, you basically are rendering what you see. In Cinema 4D and many other 3D applications, you have multiple ways you can render your scene, depending on what type of look you want. Do you want photoreal? Do you want more stylized? And so there's a plethora of different renderers just within Cinema 4D. So there's standard, there's physical. These are kind of the older renderers. But the renderer that we're going to use, and the more industry standard modern renderer, is Redshift, okay? So if we choose Redshift, you'll see that a bunch of stuff changes, but you don't have to worry about any of that. But as long as we have chosen Redshift as our renderer, any materials, lights, cameras will be compatible with Redshift. So if you don't do this, you're actually going to be making materials that are incompatible with this renderer because every renderer has their own type of material and lights and cameras, okay? So let's close out of those render settings, and to start creating materials, we are going to open up our material manager. So just like we can open and hide the coordinate manager down here, we can also reveal and hide the material manager, okay? So it's that little ball, it's a little shader ball icon. And now to create a new default material, all you need to do is double click anywhere within this material manager. So I'll double click and voila, there is our default gray material. And as long as you have this material selected, your attributes manager will show the base properties of this material. So the only thing we're going to cover in this video is just about how you can change the color and how you can change the shininess or the roughness of your material. So to change the color, you're basically going to just change the base color of your material. So let's start out by creating like a darker bluish gray for the tiles, for this little sign, and some of the cups and all these other elements here. So I'm just going to click on that color chip, and that will bring up the color chooser. And this is very familiar to the color chooser that's in After Effects or Photoshop, anything like that. And so we can change the hue here to be a little bit more blue. And then I'll just kind of bring down this little color sample to right about here, dark grayish blue. And then I'll just exit out of that. And so you'll see that updated that little preview, and you can see that this is basically a reflection in this little preview sphere. And if we want to make this a little bit more rough, we just go down to the reflection here and we'll adjust the roughness. So the higher this roughness, you'll see this update, the more blurry your reflections will be. So let's just enter in about 0.4, and this will just be our basic standard material that we'll use for everything. So everything will be a color and then have this roughness of 0.4, okay? So let's go ahead and we can rename materials just like we can rename objects. So we're just gonna double click on that MAT there, and we'll rename this dark gray. And so we can now apply this to our objects here. So if I just zoom in here, if we want to apply a material, we can do it multiple ways. We can either drag and drop this onto an object, and you'll see it will highlight any object you have your cursor hovering over. So I can release my mouse and you'll see that I just applied the material to this object. Now you'll see that this object lives underneath this group null. Now, one very handy thing is when you're selecting things, you want to apply materials directly to an object, either in your viewport, or you can also apply them in the object manager. It's helpful to select an object and reveal it in your object manager. So right now, if I wanted to find this selected object, I would need to twirl everything down and try to find it. And that's actually the hardest way to do that, because now I have to untwirl this and then untwirl this. One easy way, let me just twirl these back up again, to reveal a selected object in your object manager is to have your cursor over the object manager, and all you're going to do is hit S. So you hit the S key, and that will automatically reveal that object that you have selected in your viewport. So you can see that there's this added icon applied to this roof tile object, and this is your material tag. It basically tells you what material is applied to your object. Okay, so I can click and drag and move this anywhere, and you'll see that this will then apply to this little roof cap. So I can click and drag and apply this to all these different objects, and you'll see how that's being applied there. Now, one cool thing is, instead of having to manually apply a material to every single object, you can actually click and drag and drop this onto the null, and this will apply this material and apply it to all the children objects here, which is very, very handy, because if I want to apply this dark gray material to all of the roof elements here, I just simply need to drag and drop this all the way up to the top of this roof tile group front, and you can see that this dark gray material is applied to everything underneath. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new material. So I'm going to command click and drag, just like we can duplicate in the viewport or the object manager. We can do the same thing in the material manager to duplicate a material. And I'm just going to rename this white. So I'm going to create a more whitish material. So with this white material selected, I'm going to go down to the color here, and open up the color chooser. And one thing to know about 3D or anything in general is nothing in real life is pure white or 100% pure black. So if you're creating a white material, kind of go, maybe 85% white. And if you're going to create a black material, maybe go, 10% of that black value. Okay. So nothing pure white, nothing pure black. And so there is my white material. Now, if I wanted to apply this to, say, this little object right here, I can drag and drop. And you'll see that even though we have this main material applied to this null, and that's being applied to all the other objects underneath it, the only object that's not applying this gray material to is this object here, the roof cap, with this material tag applied to it. So if you have a material applied to an object, it's going to overwrite any material that might be coming from a parent object. Okay, so it's a very important concept to understand about materials, but we're not going to get too much into materials right now. I just want to help you apply materials to make this a little bit more colorful. Okay, so what we can do is actually, let's click and drag and bring this gray material all the way up to the roof group here, and you'll see all the objects that it has applied this material to. And now I might want to say on this little ramen side here, I might want to go and apply white to that material. See, if I hit S to reveal that sign object, you'll see, okay, this material is applied and it's overwriting that parent material that's applied to that roof group null right there. Okay, so if I wanted to say, go to this flag group and apply a red material to it, let me actually just command click and drag. Let's create a red material. I'm going to select this material, go down to the color, and let's bring this up here. Create a nice red material like so. And so if I wanted to apply this red material to this object, I can do this multiple ways. So I can drag and drop this directly into the viewport, or I can drag and drop this material directly onto this null in the object manager, and it'll apply that material that way. Okay. Now there are some objects here that I want to kind of be a wood texture. So I'm going to command click and drag, and let's create a light brown texture. Actually, let's do like a tan. So this will be the color of the wood that makes up our ramen restaurant here. So let's just go and create a nice like tan color there. And so I want to apply that tan material to this roof triangle, and I'm going to hold the shift key down to add to selection. This little support here, the roof, this little front piece right here, the flag base. And then if I rotate to the other side, I want to select this little slat right there as well. And so I have all these objects underneath this roof group that I want to apply this tan material to. And you would think, okay, I'll just manually apply this material to each of these objects. There's actually an easier way to apply this material to all the selected objects. And that is by right-clicking on the material that you want to apply and then just going to apply. And you'll see that that will then add those material tags of this tan material to all those objects. Okay. And so you can see what's going on there. Looking good. So those are the three ways you can apply a material. You can drag and drop in the viewport. You can drag and drop in the object manager. And then you can select objects and right click on a material and go to apply. So there's one last thing I want to share with you about materials is we had made objects like this stool here. So I'm just going to hit S and scroll to that selected object here. And you'll see we have this stool object. And remember, we created these instances here too. So what's really cool about instances is not only can the changes you make apply to those instance objects, but any materials you apply to that main reference object will cascade down and be applied to those instance objects as well. So if I drag and drop this red material onto this stool, you'll see that material will be applied to these instant objects as well, which is super, super cool. So I'll just apply this tan material to the stool there. And now we textured 3 objects by just texturing 1 because we're using those instances. So with that being said, I'm just going to fly through here and texture everything in my scene because it's pretty repetitive, and I'll catch you on the other end. Now, one thing I do want to point out that I haven't covered yet is if you're selecting multiple objects and you accidentally select other objects that you don't want in that selection, to deselect those objects, just hold the Command or Control key down. And you can remove those objects from selection. So Shift adds to selection, holding Command or Control removes those objects from selection. All right. All right, and with those final tweaks, I'm really digging the color scheme we got here. We're just using a handful of colors and some accent colors for the grass and the little fish cake there. But I think we're ready to start adding some lights and adding a camera as well. Now, the lighting setup we're going to use here is going to be very, very simple and going to allow us to achieve some pretty nice looking results pretty quickly because we're not going to get into 3D lighting and the nitty gritty of all that until later in this course. You could develop a whole course just on 3D lighting, okay? So I just want to set you up with an easy win. And so the lighting setup we're going to use is right here. If you click and hold, we're just going to use this Redshift Sun and Sky rig. Now, if you're not seeing this Redshift, this RS Sun and Sky, again, make sure that you have set your render setting here, the renderer, to Redshift, okay? If you have this at anything else, this is going to be totally different. This is going to be the standard renderer objects, and you can see that designated by that ST. So again, go to Redshift, and that'll actually reconnect all of our materials there. Remember, each renderer only has their own materials they support, okay? So let's go and let's grab this Sun and Sky rig, and you won't see anything happen in your scene. Now, as we've been building this whole scene out, we haven't really been seeing our final render version of what this is going to look like. So we've just been seeing this simple viewport view. This is not how this will look when we actually go to render it. To see a preview of how this will look when we render this using Redshift, we're going to go to this Redshift area right here, and we're going to select Start IPR, and this is Interactive Preview Render. So this is going to render in our viewport and allow us to still manipulate and interact with our scene, hence the name Interactive Preview. So we're just going to fire that up and you will see what happens here. So I can still hit the 1, 2, and 3 keys to navigate around, but now we're getting this rendered version. Now, because this is constantly rendering, this is going to be a little slow, okay? But we are seeing a really nicely lit, well, not nicely, we will make it look a little bit more nice, but you can see our materials in their final form. You can see our lighting coming from this Redshift Sun and Sky. If I want to deactivate this and see what this looks like without this Redshift Sun and Sky light in here, I can just click and turn those green check boxes to red X's, and you'll see this is our scene with just default bounce lighting, and our materials looks pretty flat, right? You don't get that 3D depth, and lighting is what is key to that 3D depth in your scene. So something that's really cool is if you select the Redshift Sun object here, you'll see that the axis is already kind of off kilter. It's already rotated. And because this is trying to emulate, the Sun and Sky rig is trying to emulate the realistic sun and sky lighting effects in 3D, we can actually hit the R key with that Redshift Sun selected and change the angle here. And if I make this low, we're even going to get like this cool sunset type of lighting, which is pretty awesome. So you can have a lot of fun with choosing the angle. One thing I recommend you do is try to have like a nice 45-degree angle here, because if something is like lit right straight on like this almost looks like a really cruddy iPhone flash, you know, your cell phone flash that's just straight on. So that positive Z axis, that blue line, so that is where the light is going to be pointing towards. So definitely have this at an angle, and this allows you to add some nice depth to your scene, get all these really nice shadows. And now if we select the Redshift Sky object, you'll see the Sky and the Sun tabs are both selected, revealing both of those options here in the Attributes Manager. And there's just a few things we can mess around with here. Here is the overall intensity of that Sun and Sky rig. So we can up the intensity overall. And then there's another thing that you should pay attention to, which is this ground color. And the ground color is what we're seeing right back here, this kind of dark brownish color. So we can change this by clicking on that color chip there. And maybe let's change this to something a little more bluish, like so. That's looking pretty good. So not too blue that this kind of gets lost. This blue gets lost in the background, but something enough to make this kind of pop a little bit. And so that's looking nice. And then another thing we can do if you want to play with it is this red and blue shift. So this kind of just gives you a little bit of a bluish tint if you move this to the left. If you move this slider to the right, we're going to get very orangey and wow. But if you just go less is more with this kind of stuff. So if you just go slightly negative in these values, you get like a little bluish hue. If you go slightly positive, you get this like warmish hue. So again, have fun with whatever type of vibe that you want. Actually, the warmish vibe looks kind of cool, but I think I'll go with just slightly blue here. And then another thing we can do is go down to the sun disk scale. And this is going to control the size of the sun, and the bigger the light source, the more soft your shadows will be. So here we have pretty sharp shadows, and this is again emulating actual shadows you get in sunlight. But if we increase the sun disk scale here, you'll see that the shadows get a little softer. So I don't want them that soft. Maybe I'll just soften them just a tad, just a small value in here. And you know me, let's round that out to 4. And if I change the sun tint here, this is basically the color of that sunlight. So if you, again, want to have like a bluish cast or a purplish cast of that sunlight source, you can do that here as well. So maybe warmish hue or maybe something a little more bluish. So we're just doubling down on the bluish hue, at least on my end here. And that's basically it. Now, the one thing to understand, we'll get into this a lot later, but you might actually be looking at your scene now and be like, actually, you know, with the lighting, the materials aren't looking all that great. And this is when you have to understand that in 3D, materials and lighting kind of interplay. So as you adjust the lighting, you might have to adjust the material. So always feel free to adjust the materials. If, say, this tan is a little bit too light, make that a little bit darker so that definitely pops out a little bit more and doesn't look so washed out, okay? So you can always adjust things. It's totally normal to have that back and forth. So just keep that in mind as you are messing around with your own scenes. So lastly, let's go ahead and let's add a camera in here. And so what we're going to do is, just like in After Effects, you have a camera that you can look through. So we're going to add this standard camera here by clicking and holding here. And so I'll just release my mouse. So there's our camera. We're actually not looking through this camera view. To do that, we need to click on this little kind of viewfinder icon. And once that's highlighted, we are now actually looking through our camera. And if I go up to our 4-up view here, and let's just zoom out, you can see there is our 3D camera right there, okay? And so with that camera selected, let me just maximize the perspective view here. With this camera selected, the only thing I'm gonna do is go to the Object tab here, and I'm gonna change the focal length to 200 to get an isometric kind of look. And this will immediately kind of zoom into our scene, but I'll just go ahead and zoom out of our scene here, like so. So just using the 1, 2, and 3 keys to just find our angle we want to ultimately render from. So something like this, and this is really nice isometric, and I always call this the SimCity vibes here. But that's all you needed to do. If you know cameras in real life, physical cameras, you will immediately be able to transfer all that knowledge to digital cameras. So if you are very good with photography and you know what focal length is and all this kind of stuff, you're going to be way ahead of the game when it comes to 3D, especially with lighting. All the studio lighting concepts that you learn in real life definitely apply to the digital realm. So if you want to immediately know how to improve as a 3D artist, study photography, cameras, lighting, and you're going to be an amazing 3D artist. So what I'm going to do now is let's go over to our render settings again. So we're going to click and hold, go to edit render settings. And here is where we changed our renderer to Redshift. But in the output here is where you basically can set all of your different output settings. So the width, the height, frame rate, all that kind of stuff you can set here. But for right now, the only thing I want you to worry about is the width and height. And let's render out a nice kind of square composition. So we'll just go 1280 by 1280, and I'll just hit enter, and you'll see that'll update live in our viewport here. And so all I need to do is, with that change in width and height, I can just kind of zoom in here and recompose our scene. And if I go out of my IPR view, so if I just go to Redshift, start IPR again, that will deselect it. And one nice thing you can do is in your Redshift camera, if you go to display, and twirl down this composition, you can actually bring up a compositional grid. There's all these different compositional helpers here, which is really cool. But I always like to use the grid because this will help you align and kind of center up your composition here. So using these guides, you can kind of center this up like so. And once you're ready to render, the only thing you have to do after setting the width and height here is going to your save and defining where you want to save your file. So to find out your file path, I'm just going to go and select this option here. Let's go to this orientation. I'm just going to test render here. So I'm just going to name it test render for now. And then you choose your file format. So I'm going to use a PNG. And with PNG, you can change the depth from 18 bits per channel to 16 bits per channel. So we're just adding more color information there. We don't need to worry about alpha channels or this multi-pass image. We'll uncheck that save. Well, again, we'll cover all this stuff in way more detail later. But just right now, I'm just going to show you the bare bones stuff to get a render out. And so with that file path selected and the depth in the format selected as well, to render this out to that file location that you chose, I'm just going to click and hold on this little clapper with the play button, and we're going to go render to picture viewer. And then once I do that, this is going to bring up this picture viewer window, and this is where you can view your render in progress. Okay, so we have these little what are called buckets going around and rendering our still image, and voila, just like that, we have this nice rendered image. And if you want to see that on your computer, just right click and go to show file in Explorer or Finder. You can see there's our rendered file. If I hit spacebar to preview that, you can see there is our rendered PNG. And congratulations on rendering your very first, or maybe your very first, 3D render in Cinema 4D. All right, so how are you feeling after that little crash course in 3D and Cinema 4D? We covered a lot of stuff, primitives, how to navigate, Cinema 4D UI, and a lot of other things, how to manage a lot of objects in your scene. And we're just getting started. So if your head's hurting right now, totally feel you. I was definitely there when I started learning Cinema 4D my very first day, or just 3D in general. My head was swimming. So I've been where you are, and I pushed through it just like you can, and things are only gonna get easier. It's important to get your 3D sea legs now, because there's gonna be some choppy water as we get through this course and we start progressing onto more complex topics. So if you need to go through this video a couple more times to get everything down, go ahead and do that, because what you want to do is be able to have all these shortcut keys as second nature, so you're not even thinking about it. And that's going to be setting you up for success as, again, we start to ramp up through this course. But it's important you build that really solid foundation, because as we start introducing more and more topics on top of it, it's going to be like a little Jenga tower. And if you have that shaky bottom of the Jenga, we've all been there, right? That's going to fall on you, especially when you got that big Jenga at the bars and stuff. That's a danger. You can go to the hospital if you don't have that nice solid foundation. And so it's the same thing here with Cinema 4D, but don't worry. Again, we're going to be walking you through the world of 3D, and you're going to be feeling more and more comfortable. And by the end of this course, just think about how you're going to look back and remember how you felt at this very moment. In that sense of accomplishment, there's nothing that can beat that. So think of that, visualize that, and that feeling by the end of this course, looking back, seeing where you came from, it's going to be amazing. So with that being said, don't get Jenga. You can do this. I'll see you in the next video. Welcome